Okay, so hello everyone. We start in just a second. Welcome everyone to our first web debate this year. On the 1st of March, we meet as we meet on the first Tuesday every month to discuss key issues and new developments in the field of diplomacy. For this year, we have something very special for you because this year, all of our web debates coming this year will focus on the topic of science diplomacy. And so this web debate kicks off this theme of science diplomacy, discussing how science and diplomacy are coming together, what kind of practices have been emerging, but also what has been happening in the academic debate. So with this kick-off event today, we want to dive a little bit deeper into how people make their way into the practice of science diplomacy, so how people become science diplomats. But we also want to take the opportunity to kind of look ahead into 2022. What are the kind of trends that we can expect to see? What are the kind of developments that both practitioners and scholars are kind of forecasting for 2022 and beyond? We have with us an excellent distinguished speaker, which I also personally know, and we're both friends, so it's an absolute pleasure to kick off the debate in this kind of way. So I'm going to introduce him very quickly. So this is Dr. Jean-Christophe Mourouis. At the moment, he's a lecturer in science diplomacy at University College London in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy, which he joined in 2019. He was most recently a visiting scholar at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as an associate director at the Science Diplomacy Center at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston. Having said this, I think it's also worth emphasizing that JC has a background in science. He's actually an astrophysicist and obtained his PhD and a lot of academic credentials in this field. So as you can imagine, one of the first questions from me for him is going to be how he came to be both a science diplomacy practitioner and now a science diplomacy scholar. We also have two additional people who are very close to Diplo who will come in and add further commentary, kind of further the discussion. And I'm really grateful that they could also join us. So let me very quickly take this opportunity to also introduce them. We have Professor André Schwerup. He's an associate professor at the University of Malta. But this is only telling half the story. The other half of the story is that he is also the ambassador for digital affairs of Malta. He also has a background in physics, but he looks at a very small scale. He has a background in quantum physics. And then I'm also very happy to welcome Nikola Božić to our debate. He is, again, very close to Diplo and science diplomacy. Together with him, I taught our very first course, our very first online course on science diplomacy. Nikola is a science educator and communicator, and he has a keen interest in space diplomacy. So as you can see from our scientific backgrounds that we have assembled here, we're spanning quite a wide field. Maybe just for myself, I'm a social scientist. I have a background in international relations. So let's see how we can bring all of this together. JC, I already said I wanted to start with you, and I already hinted at that. Basically, the question, with your background in astrophysics, with a career in astrophysics, working at several observatories, how did you become interested in science diplomacy, and how did you make your way into science diplomacy? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Well, thanks, Kat, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate to the web debate or web conversation here at Diplo with you and colleagues. And this is the second web debate that I have the pleasure to do as well. And one previous one was centering on space. So I think we're going to maybe come full circle today with our colleague here. So yeah, I mean, it's as you said, I'm originally I originally trained in the science and natural sciences. So physics first, and then astronomy and astrophysics, and obtained my PhD back in 2007. So it's been a while now, and that was basically, very much in a field that is focusing on the hard sciences, and not necessarily a field that you would associate with geopolitics or diplomacy, but actually, when you start delving into it and when you start, looking at the intersection, it's actually pretty wide. But the why I started being interested in the field of science diplomacy at the time, I didn't know that it was named science diplomacy, and it was not even actually coined the term before maybe 2010. But it's really because I started, the field of astronomy is very international, made from many different, people and from across the globe. And it is through the contact of my colleagues that I started understanding the profound impact of politics and geopolitics on their own careers and the own way that they were able or unable to carry out their passion and carry out research. So it's a field that is very collaborative, very small field that really goes across borders, really literally, and one where again, people have sometimes difficulty pursuing their passion in the field. So it's through the discussions with my colleagues or people who aspired getting into the field that I really started delving into the underpinnings of politics and geopolitics. And obviously the field, as I said, is extremely collaborative. So it is through those international collaborations also, and understanding how they work, how they're fostered through, government-to-government collaboration, academic collaborations, and so on, that really you start getting a sense of how much IR and diplomacy there is behind the field and science in general. So just to make a long story short, that was my initial sort of pivot, right, in terms of awareness of the field beyond its scientific objective. And I did a lot of outreach. I did a lot of engagement with international colleagues beyond just the pure science, and that ended me leaving after two actually research positions, leaving the field to work for the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, which is the international body of astronomers worldwide. And I worked for a few years in Cape Town, working on science development issues in many different countries. And in there, I was really at the contact of a host of different people, all the way up to ministries, diplomats, foundations, international organizations. And so I really got, into these interfaces, if you will, of science, policy, and diplomacy. And for personal reasons, at that point, I also decided that, well, first I knew nothing about IR, just that first contact there, due to my being sort of a practitioner there in the field, but I definitely knew nothing about diplomacy on our and theory side, and I decided to actually get a master's in there. So I also have now a master's in international relations from the Fletcher School, where I spent 2 years doing my master's, and then working also in parallel and then secondly with the AAAS, as you mentioned, and the Fletcher School in developing a science diplomacy center. So just one word before I wrap up on my trajectory, not to take too long here, but it was in a way serendipitous that on the East Coast, where I was in Boston pursuing IR, science diplomacy was really taking off because, as we all know, it's a lot of the push and emergence came from let's say the US, UK, and especially on the East Coast from Washington, DC and others. So the field was booming there, and I found myself then delving into the networks and being also carried by those networks. So it's also the importance of networks and the importance of the geographies in which you find yourself in, that also influences your career in a way. So long story short, after AAAS, I eventually ended up taking a position at University College London, which aims at developing science diplomacy research and teaching activities. And I am in the science policy department that aims at broadening its research and teaching. So that's in a nutshell my pathway to science diplomacy. And now I'm a scholar and not necessarily a practitioner, although we can actually debate whether there's a fine line between the two or not.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very important comment. Thank you for this overview. It's really interesting, especially for me because I come from the very other side. So I'm trained in international relations, in diplomatic studies, diplomatic theory and practice, and science diplomacy kind of came as one field of diplomacy among many. What I found really interesting there was that it kind of challenges traditional conceptions of diplomacy. So one of the very traditional definitions of diplomacy is basically how states manage international relations. And there have been many challenges to this definition and this way of practicing diplomacy, also challenges coming from practice. But every now and then there are concepts that really, really challenge this understanding of diplomacy, where you almost feel like with this understanding of diplomacy, we can't go on anymore because there's so many different kinds of actors we need to keep in mind. And science diplomacy is one of those examples. So I found it really interesting. And what kind of drew me to science diplomacy, not just that it's kind of a different kind of diplomacy, that it's a new concept that seems to grasp at something that has been there for a long time, but we haven't really had the tools to conceptualize it. What also drew me to it is the diversity of the field, so that it's interdisciplinary. Every room you walk into where there's a science diplomacy discussion or science diplomacy practice is most likely going to be highly interdisciplinary. And that kind of exchange, that kind of meeting of minds who come from different perspectives but want to share something, that really attracted me. So with that in mind, I would also like to ask our audience, if you are a science diplomat, can you tell us how you made your journey into this practice? Or if you're interested in working more in the field of science diplomacy, how are you pursuing that? Or what kind of challenges have you experienced so far? And with that, I would like to turn to Ambassador Schwerrup, Andre, because as I said, you're wearing two hats and you also had a really interesting journey that took you from being a quantum physicist to now also an ambassador for Malta. So can you share some of your experiences, kind of making this transition or kind of widening your scope in that regard?
Absolutely. Thanks. And it's already been a very, very interesting few minutes. And one thing I like from what JC said, and I was writing it down, is that he said that he found himself in some networks and was carried by those networks. And I think I share the same sentiments. I always say that my move towards diplomacy was almost, in the best possible sense of the word, accidental. I just found myself in the right place at the right time, so to speak, and I realized just how important, interesting, and influential this aspect of diplomacy is. I had genuinely never even heard of science diplomacy before a few years ago. I never even considered it, and I just found myself in that field, and all of a sudden I realized that I do have some sort of a calling for this. It's something which I genuinely appreciate. So just to give a bit of background, my own background is purely scientific, but through happenstance, I happened to come across a foundation called the Malta Conferences Foundation, which is somewhat of an offshoot of the AAAS that JC was also talking about. And this is a beautiful example of science diplomacy, whereby a number of scientists from all over the Middle East are brought together in one location to talk science. It is just a scientific conference. But the idea is that since you have representatives from all over the Middle East, you get this kind of environment that you never get in the real world, so to speak. And there's a lot of science for diplomacy, as well as diplomacy for science, being done in that environment. And after that, I kind of I got bitten. I got the bug, so to speak, and I started trying to see where else we could use this idea of using science to bring peoples together. At the same time, there was this really interesting change going on, whereby the European quantum technologies community was trying to gather political support from the entirety of the EU. At the time, Malta had the presidency of the EU Council, and therefore I was kind of pulled into it, kind of being the contact point of trying to see how we can coordinate this effort. And after that, I kind of realized that my scientific background is not sufficient for me to deal with the diplomatic aspect of where I was finding myself, which then brought me in touch with Diplo. So those of you who don't know, I'm actually following a course right now at Diplo, where I learned how little I actually knew about diplomacy. I have to be honest. So I'm really grateful for Katarina and all the rest of the Diplo staff who are really, really, really fantastic and have showed us how important and how useful and how good it is to pursue science diplomacy. So it's been a bit of a meandering, and I would call it a random walk actually from the from the scientific nomenclature. So it's been an interesting path, but yeah, I just have to echo JC's comments and say, you know, it is a very, very, very critical part of our world, and it is not appreciated just how much diplomacy there is in science until you're actually part of this world.
You really do confirm why I find this field so fascinating, because you spoke about kind of meandering career, so a career that is not very clear, but all the more exciting because of that, because you take opportunities and things just arise. And I think for JC, we saw, at least I saw a very similar dynamic. So this is really interesting. What I also noted a commonality is that for both of you, it seems like the exposure to the world of diplomacy or politics came first through the involvement with your respective scientific organizations and kind of the sense of what does it actually entail if we want to set up collaborations across borders, and what do we as scientists perhaps need to understand to do this better, to become more effective, and then ultimately to do our science also better. So that's what I find really interesting. Andre, also thank you for mentioning the Diplo course. If I remember correctly, we met for the first time almost a year ago in the Diplomatic Theory and Practice course. So that was a really exciting journey, because in the course we had diplomats and non-diplomats, and just out of that we had a really interesting discussion. At the end of last year, we also launched our science diplomacy course for the very first time. It's been a really enlightening, wonderful journey. It just finished, and Nicola was one of the people involved in delivering the course, in working on the course. So Nicola, I introduced you as a science educator and a science communicator. Perhaps you can also give us a quick hint about your journey into this field. The hunch is it might be slightly similar, but there are also some differences. So Nicola, if you can just quickly tell us.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Yes, my journey with Diplo and this interdisciplinary approach to very important issues worldwide started almost 20 years ago as basic education. My basic education is engineering, and I was interested in social part of engineering. So internet governance was something that connected me with Diplo's 18 years ago. But in parallel, I was also an astronomer. I wrote a short book about astronomy for kids. So, I was organizing and developing curricula for high school kids in one institution in Serbia, covering work with gifted kids in science. So I'm experienced in the field of education, specifically STEM education and astronomy as my personal part of interest. Last few years, the development of different international operations and international projects, and bringing to space and to science private business companies also started to change approach to science and to space. And last few months and few years and last few days also, we can see that there is different things happening in space, in orbit. We have a problem with debris in orbit from the spacecrafts, from satellites. We have private initiatives with space space internet providers, helping at the moment in the conflict regions, but also we have in few days we will have rocket parts of rocket having crossing the pattern with the moon. So there is a lot of things happening in the space, in the orbit, in science, from CERN to these pandemic issues and collaboration between medical experts, politicians, and diplomats. So we are witnessing the fast developing in mixing science and diplomacy and science and politics, because the world is really now global, and now we need to cooperate and to discuss different interests and different approach to the same topics. For example, the interest of private companies in the orbit and the interests of countries and the interests of citizens of the Earth is something that is very important. At the same time, we have situation that space, the exploration of the space is available to everyone from the planet. So even countries that are not having developed the space programs can join some of regional or international programs. I wrote a short blog on Diplo's website about 3 examples. One of them is example of Malta as non-space country, to say that in that words, but having educational and small research space program together with European Space Agency. We have example of India. I wanted to celebrate 75 years of independence with the exact same number of satellites, giving opportunity to small countries to run the experiments of with satellites, communication with satellites, and everything else. So even Serbia and the academic sector from Serbia will participate in that program. We have United Arab Emirates entering the orbit of Mars. So it is available to all of us, but at the same time, we need to do a lot of job together with diplomats and to write some new papers that can run us through 21st century.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for how you became interested in science diplomacy, but also for already hinting at some of the things that are ahead of us, or some of the developments we need to pay close attention. And this is basically exactly where I want to go now in this debate, is the question, what are the kind of trends we can expect for this year, or even longer term trends in the practice of science diplomacy? And for example, you just mentioned smaller countries, some developing countries, and how they make their journey into space, so to speak, or how space policy and space diplomacy does become relevant for them, how we should not only think in terms of the bigger countries and their space exploration. And there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to bring it back to JC, exactly that question in terms of trends for 2022 or any longer term developments when we talk about science diplomacy that you would highlight from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Kat, and thank you, Andre and Nicola, for also sharing your pathways and into the field and your interests. It's very interesting to see similarities here as well in the pathways. Although just Kat, to mention that there is a little bit of a bias in the community that a lot of scientists are actually interested in science diplomacy, or maybe I'm not saying that, of course, diplomats are interested in science because they recognize the rising importance of S&T challenges, of course, but we do tend to see a lot more aspiring science diplomats like ourselves being from a science background, where we actually need a lot of inputs and experience and expertise from the diplomatic community as well. And so it's absolutely key that we learn from one another in terms of the communities and not skew too much towards one or the other, which skews also the discourse in terms of the science diplomacy, the way that it's construed as well. I think just in terms of the trends, I mean, I guess trends come and go. They're sometimes set by various agendas, be it from countries or international organizations, by certain scholars, by a variety of actors, also depending on the moment in terms of the geopolitical landscape that's taking place. So it's very difficult to see, or set to make sure that we know meaning to know what trends will be. But one thing that can be noticed, and you just hinted at it, is the way that maybe the narrative of science diplomacy is shifting a little bit from where it originated. So we know that the coining of the term, if you will, as Andre remarked on emanates from countries from the global north, specifically the US and the UK, from the Royal Society meeting in 2009 that led to the famous report and the three-pronged approach of science diplomacy in 2010, although that's not the only framework. Now several other frameworks have been brought forward, but similarly by actors that are of a specific kind, and we can go back into this. But we see increasingly the narrative shifting a little bit to the global south, for example. So smaller nations, but also developing nations, the BRICS countries, and the countries in the developing world have different interests and different objectives in a way that the global north, and certainly in the way that science diplomacy was pushed originally in 2010 from certain actors. So we see more emphasis on the global south and the perspective there, and the reframing of science diplomacy and what it means, and in practice how it can help developing nations, whether it is in their science diplomacy strategy and global engagement, as well as their place in highly advanced technical and scientific issues in international negotiations and other topics. So I think we're seeing that shift in terms of the rise of the global south, which is great. And also a lot of talk about inclusivity as well, because it's been most of the narrative for now, and this is my own opinion, has been pushed by state actors. Some of the leaders in the field are practitioners working for states and governments. And we see increasingly a yearning from civil society, from organizations, foundations, scholars to actually push also a different narrative, sometimes a bit too rosy, for the likes of the realists in IR. But this is definitely something that also is being a trend that we see. So finally, I would say just the trend that has been also put forward by scholars is that the field should move beyond discourses, narratives and discourses, and become a bit more empirical in the way that it actually looks at science diplomacy as a field, and the way that it can actually bring policy or diplomacy impact in the way that those interfaces are working or not working, as we saw in the pandemic and in other situations, right? So it's really unpacking those interfaces and looking under the hood and trying to really analyze them and potentially make it better, if I can be an advocate of that. That's what I would say. So very difficult question to answer, but I hope it's I tried in a way to address that.
Definitely. And sometimes asking the questions is more important than delivering exact answers, instead like pointing in certain important directions. And I think you pointed in quite a number of important directions. So one, the rise of smaller countries, developing countries, a very strong call over the last couple of years for greater inclusivity, both concerning developing countries and marginalized scholars, but also concerning actors that are sometimes a bit pushed to the sideline. In my mind, for example, civil society. So I think these are very important trends. Just to follow up on something you mentioned or you hinted at, that there's a trend among some scholars to start to be a little bit more critical when it comes to discussing science diplomacy, so kind of taking off the rose-colored glasses and kind of saying, when we talk about science diplomacy, we talk a lot about cooperation and addressing global challenges, but when we actually look at the practice in some areas is not really delivering. And so I just wanted to bring into the conversation, there's one recent paper that makes this point very, very strong. It's by Dr. Tim Flink. The title is Taking the Pulse of Science Diplomacy and Developing Practices of Valuation. And in the paper, he not just makes this critique, but he also says, maybe we need to come up with a framework to evaluate the practice of science diplomacy, to really see where it's going well and how we can improve. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss. Can we even agree on a framework if we, at this point, don't have an agreed upon science diplomacy definition? Do we need an agreed upon definition to have a framework? These kind of questions. But it's a very interesting development, which for me also points to the fact that the field is maturing, that since we have the term, since the discussion really took shape and started in about 2007, a lot of things have happened, and we're kind of maybe entering a phase of greater maturity. So just to add that. JC, you also wrote a paper on looking at science attachés, which is one example of practicing science diplomacy, and a really interesting one. And there in particular, their response to COVID-19, or how the network, the interface of science attachés was able to react to the pandemic, and where you and colleagues who wrote that paper kind of saw some of the challenges and also making suggestions for the future for kind of improving the practice of science diplomacy. So when we talk about trends, obviously, I think we're a lot more aware that the next global pandemic might be just around the corner. We've barely recovered. We're still in the throes of COVID-19. But are there perhaps lessons learned or suggestions from looking at what happened, how this particular group of science diplomacy practitioners responded, and what we can take from that going forward?
Thanks, Katerina. I mean, so one of the aims that I personally have, and I know others also have that aim, is to do research in a way that has, we would call it at STEEP, my department, policy impact, that really informs the work of practitioners, right? And again, move away a little bit from just the pure discourse or the search for a definition of the field, which has been, ongoing for the last 10 years, and I think it'll remain elusive for many decades, to be honest. But it's really to try to look at certain actors and certain networks, and to try to understand where the points of frictions are, and the way that potentially things are working or not working, and then investigate and bring to light maybe potential ways forward. So that's how I believe that the research can make an impact in the way that it helps practitioners and betters the interfaces and the brokering that happens between science and diplomacy. So one of the archetypes, if you will, of science diplomacy from a state perspective in advanced economies, are the ones that can afford it, because obviously it's only limited to a subset of nations that can, are the science attaché networks by essence. Which are the sort of the scientific foreign policy arm or economic diplomacy arm sometimes of states around issues of science. And one of the things that colleagues and myself, so practitioners that I talk to on a regular basis, and I had remarked, is that a lot of the science networks had been bypassed in the pandemic, or in a way were not delivering as we thought that they could have been delivering in the pandemic. So that was out of that surprising, in a way, realization that colleagues and I wrote the paper calling for like unearthing a little bit why the issues behind it, and also calling for research to be done in terms of broader research to be done to understand how these networks function and how they can better function. So I think just to stay on the brief side, it's interesting how science diplomacy as a field is rising. There's no doubt about it. It's diluting a little bit through rebranding and a lot of different rebranding according to different perspectives and fields. But one thing interesting is that maybe the crowd in the science diplomacy are a bit in an echo chamber, because quite a few of the policy networks sometimes are not even aware of science diplomacy networks and even the science attachés, right? And we saw this even in the UK, which is very surprising. So it's really trying to understand how to increase the visibility of these networks and utilize them better is really what we were calling for in the paper. And so hence doing more empirical research through interviews, surveys on a large scale to understand how to better those interfaces which are existing here in advanced economies.
Thank you so much. So if we can formulate one trend, but perhaps as a normative suggestion, is overcoming of echo chambers, and not just science diplomacy as its own echo chamber, but my feeling is, and I think from what I heard you say, you agree, is that within science diplomacy, both practice and scholarship are also echo chambers that could perhaps speak to each other more. So that's a very interesting, very useful suggestion. We had a really rich discussion in the chat. I saw a number of people introduce themselves, kind of share their background, which was fantastic. But we also had a number of questions which cover really the whole of our discussion. So Andre, if you allow me, I'm going to ask my colleague Katarina Angelkovic to summarize all the questions and then give the floor to you to kind of pick and choose where you want to come in. Katarina, over to you.
Thank you, Kat. Yes, indeed, we have received quite a few questions, and let me try to summarize them. We have received a question from Encia, who wonders if it is necessary to get a degree in diplomacy with science background in order to become a science diplomat. And Encia also asked where one can look for science diplomacy jobs. Moreover, Gökhan, who is a PhD student at Satellite Communications and Remote Sensing program, and at the same time carrying out public diplomacy masters in science studentship, asks how he can combine both of these to go into detail in science diplomacy. Molod wonders what kind of impact do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine will have on science diplomacy in the short and long term? And what role, if any, science diplomacy can have to influence the situation on the ground. And finally, we have received a few comments from Takare, who wonders if it is safe to say that the Global South interprets science diplomacy very differently from the Global North. So what is the difference between the two narratives? And there are different schools of thoughts in international relations, for instance, realism, constructivism. So what school of thought do you think that science diplomacy relies on? And the final question from Tahare is the negotiation on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action considered a subject of science diplomacy? So that's all for now. Back to you, Kat.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of questions. I would like to give the floor first to Andre, because you already had your hand up before. So feel free to come in and kind of address, pick and choose whatever what you want to address, kind of a picnic style, if you want.
Sure, absolutely. Actually, there's a couple of things which are really quite interesting, and Enche and I are both part of the Global Young Academy, which is also one of the groups that brought me closer to this idea of science and diplomacy, which I forgot to mention earlier. One of the comments that JC made, which I'd love to pick on, if I may, and it also ties in with Tarek's comment about the global north and global south. I see the point that JC was making, that so not every country can afford a network of science attachés, etc. And this kind of speaks in some sense it might seem like it's speaking to the global south versus global north narrative, but I think the distinction is actually broader than that. Malta, for example, is too small to have anything approaching a proper bona fide a science attaché network. But what a position like mine, if I were to be so bold as to say that, but what a position like this allows us to do is it allows us to keep a finger on the sort of the scientific pulse of the world and ensure that when there are communiques going between our foreign ministry and embassies and so on and so forth, there is at least some sort of connection to the technical world and these networks of technical attachés, and that we basically leverage all of that knowledge to at least see where we can intervene, where we can make some changes, basically giving us a technical voice in this part of diplomacy that we wouldn't otherwise have. It is impossible for us to, of course, have something at the same level as the UK or the US or even New Zealand. I mean, Peter Gluckman is a force, is a genuine force in the field. But there are some very, very interesting niches where even the smaller or less resourced countries can contribute. At least this is my personal experience of it. I would also like to just briefly mention one point. I can't answer the question of, about Ukraine in entirety. It's a very, very, very complex question. But as Enche knows, we've been having a discussion on the sidelines of the GIA about what is the role of science and scientists vis-a-vis the conflict? Should we speak up? Should it be allowable for countries to retaliate and impose sanctions on scientific institutions? So there's an interesting sort of sideline to this narrative as to kind of where do science diplomats and where does science diplomacy in the broadest sense fit in the context of war, context of this very, very difficult struggle that Ukraine is going through. I don't have any answers to this, of course. I have my own opinions, but it does highlight that the discussion is actually much broader, much deeper than might seem in the first instance.
Thank you so much for this comment. So just to summarize the questions quickly again, we had a question of, as a scientist, do you need a degree in diplomacy to practice science diplomacy? Where or how to look for jobs? The Russia-Ukraine crisis and immediate and long-term impacts on science diplomacy. The difference in perspective between the global north and the global south. And then lastly, schools of thought in IR in which seem most resonant with science diplomacy. Almost seems like a question for me, the last one, but I first want to go to JC and again, pick and choose which questions you find most interesting to reply to. And yeah, let's see where we can take the conversation from there.
Yeah, no worries, Kat. And I don't have the answers to all those questions, to be honest, so I can just try to make an educated guess on some of them. Just to follow up on what Andres said, countries definitely engage in various different ways in science diplomacy, right? And they have their own ways. Some countries have an advisor to, science advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Some don't. Some have science attachés networks. Some don't. So it's always, it depends on the ways that you engage in these spheres. So what I meant by science attachés networks is that those are, quite visible networks that are quote unquote easily studied in a way because they're there, right? But even those networks have their own issues that can be studied and looked at is what I meant. And just to also follow up on the way that science diplomacy is sometimes perceived, yes, we are idealists in a way, and we want to see science diplomacy as being a positive force to try to address global challenges and bring closer the world of science and diplomacy and solve some of those global challenges. but states can use and wield science and technology in very different ways that are not necessarily positive, or positive for, it depends who, right? It's a value judgment, it's a value call. And we've seen uses of science diplomacy by states that are to inflict, put sanctions or try to, make it more difficult for such and such state to do things, so it has, we've seen this from the US and China perspective in science. We've seen this even in the European Union and Swiss relationship. We may see it again with the EU and Ukraine. So various different ways that science diplomacy can be used by states, and it's not just necessarily a rosy picture, right? When you talk about science diplomacy, and this is something that we're not addressing, I guess, enough, is unfortunately those negative, case studies that we can see, and that I guess is a good segue to look at look into the school of thoughts, right? In terms of the IR, I mean, we do have people in the science diplomacy community that look at power relations, and look from a realism, prism. But we also have people looking at international scientific organizations looking from a constructivist point of view. So all kinds of perspectives and school of thoughts are valid in a way to look at science diplomacy, depending on the background that you have. You might come up with different thoughts, different useful information that you can derive from that. It's not a single block, right? I mean, the same way that diplomacy can be looked at in those various different ways. So that was just to follow up on this. In terms of the question, very quickly, in terms of what degree you need to get into the field, again, I think there are various ways to get into science diplomacy, and you don't necessarily need a PhD in science or PhD in IR, or a blend of the two, or a second master's or whatnot. A number of us have PhDs and have chosen to do a second master's, but certainly that's potentially because the field hasn't developed in the way that it should be developing from the onset, blending those two tracks. And this is what we're trying to do in the teaching, both at Diplo and other in universities and things, that programs that are ongoing, is trying to blend early on those two tracks, right? So that you don't have to, accumulate diplomas to get into that sphere, or feel like you have to. So in very briefly, I think that there are a host of positions that you can get into without PhDs or double masters, or you name it, right? And again, there are very different careers that you can have in science diplomacy, whether you're working for the states, say a science attaché or a science advisor, or if you're an employee of a science foundation or a nonprofit that's working on international scientific issues and transnational collaboration. You can be working in the UN, on science, technology, and innovation issues, for example. So careers are very vast and different, and they're not. And I want to just reiterate this: they're not signposted yet as such, in a way, as science diplomats or science diplomacy positions, and that is an issue that we have in the field, right? Both the fact that the field is a very large umbrella term, and the fact that those positions are not yet signposted under that umbrella term. So that's just maybe a very quick answer to some of the questions that were there.
Thank you so much. This has been excellent, I think, because also it's very important to address this question of how people can make their way into a career in science diplomacy. And from what I've seen in terms of conversations we had as part of the course, it's a very important question for many. So thanks for giving us some pointers. Nicola, last but not least, final word, over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to follow JC mentioning that scientists are more interested for science diplomacy than diplomats, and that's important question. And my comment is that this year and the following years we need to establish a platform to help capacity building in the field of diplomacy, and to make better understanding between science and diplomacy. because the following events will develop very fast in science and in science and diplomacy, and we need to have all actors and all stakeholders involved in processes developing future rules for science collaboration and international collaboration in the field of science. That's the short comment at the end.
Thank you. This was almost a tweet style, which was perfect because we're already over time. So all that remains for me to do is to thank our audience for the interesting questions, for sharing their background, for having a really sustained discussion in the chat. So thank you so much for being with us today. And then also let me thank the people who really brought the debate alive with their contributions. So Nicola Božič, Ambassador Andrei Schwerup, and Dr. J.C. Moudry. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be back next month on the 6th of April, which is the first Tuesday in the month, with another debate, again, broadly in the area of science diplomacy. We will keep you up to date and we will email you the details, and it would be great to see many of you in 1 month again. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been a real pleasure. And as we saw, a lot more things we could have discussed, but let us make a stop here and reconvene perhaps in a month or perhaps by email and other means in between. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if we're off the air at the moment.
Well, we're still recording, so.
I'm sure
It's
we
still
can...
recording.
Yes, I think it's still recording.
Yes.
Again, thank you for joining us, and I will be in touch